Some serial killers lurk in the shadows. Jeffrey Dahmer hid in plain sight, a quiet, unassuming man, the kind of neighbor you'd barely notice. He shopped at the local grocery store. He made small talk with his landlord. He even had drinks at the bar down the street. But behind the walls of apartment 213 was a house of horrors. The smell? Overpowering. Neighbors complained for months. Officers were called to his home, but they left, unaware of the nightmare inside. The noises? Bone-chilling. Victims tried to escape. Some even ran for their lives. But they weren't always believed. And the police? They were right there. More than once. But what if I told you that Jeffrey Dahmer could have been stopped years before his final victim? How does a man like this evade justice for over a decade? How did so many warning signs go ignored? And the most haunting question of all, could there be another Jeffrey Dahmer walking among us today? This is the shocking case of Jeffrey Dahmer and what you didn't know.
To understand how Jeffrey Dahmer became one of the most infamous serial killers in history, we need to go back to a childhood marked by obsession, isolation, and darkness. Born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer entered the world like any other child. But behind closed doors, his world was unraveling. His parents' marriage was a battlefield, loud, chaotic, toxic. His mother, struggling with mental illness and addiction. His father, emotionally distant, buried in his work. And young Jeffrey was caught in between. As a boy, Dahmer was quiet, withdrawn. But there was something else, something disturbing. While other children played with toys, Jeffrey was drawn to something else. Death. It started with roadkill. He collected bones, dissected carcasses. He wasn't afraid of death. He was fascinated by it. His father, a chemist, once showed him how to bleach animal bones, never realizing the monster he was helping to create. By high school, Dahmer was unraveling. He drank constantly, hiding liquor in his locker, stumbling through the hallways, slurring his words in class. His classmates thought it was funny. They called it doing a Dahmer. But it wasn't a joke. It was a warning. By the age of 14, the fantasies had already begun. The urge to kill, the desire to control, to own someone completely. For years, he resisted. He told himself he could fight it. But the darkness inside Jeffrey Dahmer was growing, and in just a few short years, it would take over. Coming up, the moment when Jeffrey Dahmer took his first life, and the chilling mistakes that let him walk free. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer battled his urges. He tried to suppress them, to drown them in alcohol. But in the summer of 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating high school, he finally gave in. His first victim was an 18-year-old hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, a normal kid, just looking for a ride. But the moment he stepped into Jeffrey Dahmer's car, his fate was sealed. Dahmer lured him in with promises of alcohol, music, a place to hang out. They drank, they talked. But when Hicks tried to leave, something inside Jeffrey Dahmer snapped. He couldn't let him go. He grabbed a dumbbell, raised it high, and brought it down on the back of Hicks' skull. But the most disturbing part? It wasn't enough. Dahmer needed to make sure he could never leave. Stephen Hicks was dead, and now Dahmer had a problem. He dismembered the body, methodically, piece by piece, dissolving the flesh in acid, pulverizing the bones with a hammer, scattering the remains in the woods behind his home. And just like that, the first kill was behind him. But the monster inside, Jeffrey Dahmer, was only waking up. The terrifying part? He almost got caught. Months later, Dahmer was pulled over by police. In his car, several large garbage bags filled with body parts. If the officers had searched them, they would have uncovered a nightmare. But they didn't. They let him go. And the world kept turning, unaware that Jeffrey Dahmer had just gotten away with murder. Had they opened those bags, had they looked just a little closer, the world might never have known the name Jeffrey Dahmer. Coming up, years of silence. Then, the moment when Jeffrey Dahmer returns, and his true reign of terror begins. For over a decade, Jeffrey Dahmer lived a chilling double life. By day, he was quiet, polite, even forgettable. But by night, He was something else entirely. A hunter, a predator, a man whose urges were no longer under control. For 9 years after his first kill, Dahmer tried to suppress his urges. But in 1987, the monster returned. Dahmer picked up 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a bar in Milwaukee. He booked a motel room, planning only to spend the night. But the next morning, Stephen Twomey was dead. This day, Dahmer claims he doesn't remember killing him. Only that when he woke up, Twomey's chest was crushed, his body limp, lifeless. But instead of turning himself in, Dahmer had a different reaction. He panicked, then he cleaned up the mess. Then, he did it again. He stuffed Twomey's body into a suitcase, took it home, dismembered him, and for the first time, he realized just how easy it was to get away with murder. 1989. Jeffrey Dahmer is arrested, but not for murder, for molesting a 13-year-old boy. It should have been the moment his dark secret was exposed. 1 year. That's all he served. 1 year, before being set free to kill again, and this time, he had no intention of stopping. The early 90s, Dahmer wasn't just killing, he was experimenting. His apartment wasn't just a crime scene, it was a human slaughterhouse. His methods grew more disturbing. He drilled holes into skulls, injected acid to create zombies, men who would obey him completely. But the experiments failed, and when they did, he killed them. One by one, they vanished. 1990, 1991. The body count was rising, but no one suspected a thing. Because Jeffrey Dahmer didn't look like a monster. But even the most careful killers make mistakes. And in 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer made his last one. Coming up, the man who got away, and the night that finally ended Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror. Jeffrey Dahmer should have been stopped. The warning signs were there. The cries for help, ignored. The chances to catch him wasted. And the most tragic part? Some of his victims were handed right back to him. May 27, 1991. It was just after midnight when 2 Milwaukee police officers responded to a call. A woman had found a young, half-naked boy wandering the streets, bleeding and incoherent. The boy's name was Phone. He was only 14 years old. He was drugged, confused, terrified, and he was trying to escape Jeffrey Dahmer. But when officers arrived, so did Dahmer. He told them it was just a misunderstanding, that the boy was his boyfriend, that he'd had too much to drink, and the officers believed him. Instead of saving the boy, they led him right back to Dahmer's apartment. Phone was dead within an hour. The smell of death, the sound of screams, the chilling sense that something was terribly wrong. Dahmer's neighbors saw it. They reported it. They called the police again and again. But every time, their concerns were dismissed. One woman had been trying to warn authorities for 2 years. But because Jeffrey Dahmer was quiet, polite, and because his victims were young men of color, the police looked the other way. Years later, in an interview, Dahmer himself explained just how easy it was to fool people. He looked harmless. He spoke softly. He didn't look like a monster. And because of that, he got away with murder. Again, and again, and again. But all killers make mistakes. And in July of 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer made the one mistake that would finally bring him down. For 13 years, Jeffrey Dahmer had been hunting, killing, and getting away with it. He had slipped past police, fooled his neighbors, and outsmarted everyone who came close to exposing him. But in the summer of 1991, it all came crashing down. Tracy Edwards, 32 years old. He had no idea that when he followed Jeffrey Dahmer into his apartment that night, he was walking into the home of a serial killer. Dahmer locked the door. He told Tracy he wanted to take pictures, that he should just relax. But then, he pulled out a knife. 4 hours, Dahmer kept him captive, muttering strange things, rocking back and forth. At one point, he rested his head against Tracy's chest and said he just wanted to listen to his heart, because he was going to eat it. Then, an opportunity. Dahmer became distracted. Tracy Edwards seized his chance and ran. Tracy Edwards flagged down Milwaukee police, still in handcuffs, still in shock. He led them back to Dahmer's apartment, and what they found inside would haunt them forever. The first thing they noticed, the smell. It was thick, rancid, unmistakable. Then, the Polaroids, dozens of them, gruesome, horrifying photos of bodies, mutilated, posed, dismembered. The officers realized, with growing horror, these weren't fake. They were real. And then came the final discovery. The moment officers opened the fridge and found a human head staring back at them, the nightmare was real. Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror was over. After 13 years, 17 victims, and countless missed opportunities, Jeffrey Dahmer had finally been caught. With Jeffrey Dahmer finally in custody, the world braced itself for answers. Why did he do it? How did he choose his victims? And most disturbingly, did he feel any remorse? For hours, Dahmer spoke with detectives, and what he told them was beyond comprehension. There was no panic, no remorse, just a cold, methodical recounting of the horrors he committed. He described, in chilling detail, how he lured his victims, how he drugged them, strangled them, and what he did to their bodies afterward. And then, he revealed something even more disturbing. He didn't kill because of hatred or anger. He killed because he wanted to keep his victims forever. By early 1992, Dahmer's trial was underway. He pleaded guilty, admitting to the murder of 17 young men. But his defense? Insanity. Prosecutors, however, saw it differently. They argued that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions, that he planned every detail, and that he enjoyed it after. Weeks of testimony, the verdict was in. Jeffrey Dahmer was sane and guilty. He was sentenced to 16 life terms, more than 900 years in prison. But for the families of his victims, justice did little to ease the pain. Then came one of the most unforgettable moments in courtroom history. Pain, the devastation, the horror. After years of torment, the families of Dahmer's victims couldn't contain their grief any longer. Jeffrey Dahmer was locked away in Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. But even behind bars, his story wasn't over. First, Dahmer seemed resigned to his fate. He even gave interviews, claiming he had found God and repented for his sins. But not everyone believed his redemption was real. One morning, while cleaning bathrooms, Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were left alone with a man named Christopher Scarver, a fellow prisoner with a history of violent outbursts. Scarver later claimed he had received divine orders to rid the world of Jeffrey Dahmer. And so, with a metal rod from the prison weight room, he bludgeoned Dahmer to death. Dahmer was pronounced dead at 34 years old. The families of his victims had mixed reactions. Some believed justice had finally been served. Others believed it was too easy of an ending. And just like that, the Milwaukee Cannibal was no more. Even after Jeffrey Dahmer's death, one question remains. Did we ever learn the full truth? Jeffrey Dahmer's father, Lionel, has spoken publicly about his son's transformation into a monster. But did he see the warning signs? He later admitted that Jeffrey showed disturbing behavior as a child. His fascination with dead animals, his growing detachment from reality. But was it denial? Or was Jeffrey simply too good at hiding his darkness? His own grandmother, whom he lived with for years, suspected something was wrong. She often complained about the awful smell coming from the basement. She found a gun, a severed male mannequin, even suspicious chemicals. And yet, nothing was done. Was Jeffrey Dahmer destined to kill? Or did his environment create him? Some experts believe Dahmer was born with an incomplete conscience, a sociopath from birth. Others argue that his upbringing played a major role. A lonely child, a broken home, a growing void he tried to fill with alcohol, and eventually, murder. But if Dahmer's childhood was the cause, why didn't millions of other troubled children become killers? Jeffrey Dahmer confessed to 17 murders. But what if that wasn't the full number? Some investigators believe Dahmer killed more victims in the late 1970s and early 80s, before he perfected his methods. Young men who simply vanished, their disappearances never linked to him. One case in particular stands out. A 1974 disappearance. In Ohio, a young man, last seen hitchhiking, never found. The area? Just miles from Dahmer's home. The timeline? A perfect match. Did he take more lives than he admitted? Or was the monster we knew just the tip of the iceberg? In the end, the scariest part about Jeffrey Dahmer isn't just what he did. It's how easily he got away with it. How many warnings were ignored. How close he came to being caught, again and again. And worst of all, how many more like him walk among us, unnoticed. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. He was hiding in plain sight. A man who lived among us, who walked the same streets, who smiled in family photos, while committing unthinkable horrors behind closed doors. But the most terrifying part of Dahmer's story isn't just what he did. It's how many chances there were to stop him, and how the system failed. Again and again, neighbors saw the signs. Victims escaped. People called for help, but no one listened. A 14-year-old boy, drugged and bleeding, was handed back to his killer. A system meant to protect turned a blind eye. And that raises the most chilling question of all. If another Jeffrey Dahmer walked among us today, would we see it coming? What do you think? Could Jeffrey Dahmer have been stopped long before his final victim? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into true crime as disturbing as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth cases just like this one. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload, because the scariest stories are the ones that are real. See you in the next one.